Hi, welcome to Artist and Critic. I'm Don Gray. Today's program is going to deal with the paintings of my wife, Jessie Benton Evans Gray, and myself, which are going to be on exhibition at the Pond Lane Gallery in Southampton at the time of the showing of this program. We're both basically realist artists. We call ourselves figurative expressionists because there is a recognizable image, but we do paint with a great deal of emotionality and feeling and a very intense relationship to the subject that we paint, which covers all fields: landscapes, figures, still lifes. So perhaps without any further ado, we'll start with one of Jessie's paintings called The Wave, rather large acrylic, about 4 by 5 feet. Tremendous dramatic skies, as you can see, surging forms. And what I'm going to attempt to do is relate both of us to artists in the past who have not necessarily influenced us directly, but whose work has similar qualities to ours, or ours has similar qualities to theirs, so that we can see something of the where we stand in the tradition of art. We consider ourselves to be part of the mainstream of the Western tradition of painting. And we can, obviously, Jessie's dramatic landscapes have something in common with El Greco, his very electric sky, his very dramatic concept of subject. And I would say both, in each case, there's a certain mystical, poetic response to nature. Jessie's is perhaps harder, perhaps a little stronger, in keeping with the Americanism of our origins and so forth. American painters tend to have a certain harshness, a certain strength of form, of pattern. We can look at Jessie's Sun Through Clouds, and we see again this tremendous opening up of the heavens, the light against the darkness of the clouds. We might say almost a spiritual sense of hope or new beginning coming around the dark thunder clouds, the storm clouds, and certainly a relationship with El Greco. Now we can keep in mind too, certainly Albert Pinkham Ryder's In the Trough of the Sea, the late 19th century American painter. There are certainly similarities in common of the drama of nature, the contrast of lights and darks, the strength of patterns and so forth. Jessie's pastel, very vivid and luminescently orange and blue, of a marsh in Maine. I particularly want to ask us to look at the shapes of the clouds, particularly the dragon-like cloud or lizard-like cloud in the upper right-hand corner, and keep that form in mind as we go to Albert Pinkham Ryder's The Racetrack. And we pull back a little bit and we see the shape dominating the sky. Very similar in feeling, in style, and it must be said, of course, that Jessie did not paint her picture copying Ryder's The Racetrack, not the Racetrack. The Racetrack would be the Racetrack if we were in England and all, but it's basically the Racetrack. A very serious picture. I'm smiling, but it's still serious, where death circles the track in his eternal quest for the souls and bodies of mankind, a serpent in the lower foreground that suggests death, evil, and perhaps in a strange way a resurrection. Christ has often been identified with a serpent, strangely enough. But the similarity of shape and conception in the pictures is something that springs simply from the unconscious, the basic fiber of Jessie's personality as an artist, and of course Ryder's personality as an artist. We look at Jessie's Thunderclouds over Mount Adam and Eve, a tremendously powerful painting, sinuous, twisting forms in the sky and certainly in the land that seem to inundate the whole landscape with upheaval, with rhythm, with feeling. Jessie is very lyrical, very emotional, and I think you can see why we call ourselves figurative expressionists, because it's certainly recognizable as a realistic object, but it's been filtered through the strength of her own emotions. The path swirls off into the distance in search of its own and her own destiny. She's recently been fascinated by paths and is about to initiate a new series of paintings that explore the symbolic qualities of that. But of course the curving lines and patterns of her work is very similar to, but different from, the work of Van Gogh, as it was similar to but different from El Greco and Albert Pinkham Ryder. Of course, Van Gogh's Starry Night, a masterpiece of spirituality, we might say, of yearning for heaven, for the meaning of the cosmos. Van Gogh is one of the early precursors of 20th century Expressionism. And certainly in Kokoschka's The Tempest, or The Bride of the Wind, painted about 1914, suggesting some of the upheaval of the First World War, which is about to begin or is just begun. The twisting forms, the emotionalism, has a relationship to Jessie's work, no question about it. And particularly her next picture coming up is called The Storm, and we compare the tempest-tossed quality of Kokoschka with that of Jessie's painting, and we see this conflict of shape, drama of shape. I don't want to necessarily stress the conflict aspect, but there's a great drama, and certainly when someone is this expressive and using lights and darks so strongly, one is forced to realize the symbolic potential of light and darkness, for goodness and evil, for spiritual fulfillment, and the darkness of desolation and sin, if we want to put it that way. I mean, all these things can come into it. There's a certain swirling quality in all of her work. One of my favorites is her Sea Point Beach with Snow. Well, obviously, I'm quite fond of all of them, but there's something sort of perhaps a little gentler, a little more lyrically lovely in the pattern, the curving of the beach, the car tracks that lead through the snow to the beach, and the little curving of the bay. To me, the gentle lyricism and pattern of a picture like this has something in common with this early 18th century Japanese print of a woman in a kimono, and if we pan down the figure, we see the swirling, curving, graceful lyricism of the patterns. A little bit different aspect of Jessie's work may be seen in Moon with Pink Cloud, or vice versa. This almost Rubenesque lump of Crisco nude hanging there in the sky, very full and heavy and solid, with a tiny little moon rising as sort of the third layer above the picture. We have the moon, we have the cloud, and we have the landscape, ending with the moon, the apex of the triangle, very powerful, very expressive. And we go to another vertical picture. Well, no, it's not a vertical picture. We'll see it the next time. Her painting of Marsh has a similar poetic feeling for nature, for pattern. She emphasizes, sometimes simplifies, sometimes activates the curves of landscape to make these wonderfully significant patterns. Here's the picture I was referring to. The sun through trees, shafts of sunlight that come through. That seems very not only powerful visually and design-wise, but very significant, again, in terms of the symbolic nature of light. Light lives in her paintings with a special intensity and a special force. One could perhaps think of Georgia O'Keeffe to a degree in some of Jessie's work, but believe me, she is extremely original, and I only point out these relationships to help us see her work and to understand what she's trying to accomplish. In another very interesting picture called The Frog, or Frog on a Little Shore, we can almost barely see the frog in the lower center of the picture, a tiny little thing surrounded by the drama of looping, curving darkness and the lightness of the sandy shore. I mean, obviously, for those exposed to pictures, we realize that it is the drama of darkness and light, of the darkness signifying deeper, darker reservoirs of perhaps despair or fear or death or anything that we commonly associate with dark, and the light with a certain redemptive quality, a certain beneficent, almost holy, salvational quality. And so this dramatic contrast of light and dark, and of course the wonderful linking of the two with the little pathway of black on the lower left and the curving loop of black at the upper right make it tremendously significant visually. Some of the obvious drama and power of her work can be seen in a powerfully drawn a series of two pastels of woodchucks, dead woodchucks lying in their own blood, flies crawling on them. And we can say, well, good gravy, folks, this isn't what painting is supposed to be. This isn't what art, I always thought art was supposed to be pretty pictures. Well, the weakest art is, the strongest art deals with the profound issues that animate all of our lives, and certainly death and suffering, as well as joy and lyrical response to the moods of nature, are some of the real things that we encounter in life, you know, like inflation and political corruption or religious fulfillment. All of these things are real and meaningful, and Jessie has latched on in this particular picture powerfully to the aspect of physical death, and she presents it solidly and very vividly and very beautifully. Strangely enough, the way Goya makes the death of the rebels beautiful in a way in his painting of 1814 or so. We look at Jessie's next woodchuck, a vertical painting, the same woodchuck, and we see again this powerful dynamic image, a single large figure filling the picture. And obviously when an artist does that, and the response we get from it when we look at an artist who's done that is the feeling of she's expressing something of herself, she's identified with the woodchuck, and we in our turn are forced to identify the woodchuck, are forced to confront our own mortality, to cast aside for a moment, if we dare, if we're strong enough, our belief in our invulnerability, if we're healthy, our belief in our immortality of body, which obviously facts contradict their immortality of the spirit, yes, of the body, no way. Perhaps this is an interesting segue into my first picture, from dead woodchucks to an artist isolated in his studio, perhaps, self-portrait with dollar bill, about 3 by 3.5 feet, and I'm holding the dollar bill, as I may have mentioned before, and we see the hand, the real hand, held below the mirror, and all the rest of the image is reflected in the mirror, and it has something to say about the grasping materiality of the world and how the artist must try to maintain his or her ideals, his principles, and work despite the blandishments of money and materialism or their complete absence. Obviously, both are difficult for artists to deal with. I see myself in the great tradition of excuse me, American and Western European painting. I feel like I'm a direct descendant of Winslow Homer, for example, his 8 bells, not in terms of style, but just simply in response to a poetic response to nature, to reality. My style is different than his, but there's a sense of man and his destiny, whether man in nature or man in his studio. I feel a certain relationship to Thomas Eakins in what I see as his honest, direct delineation of not only the human figure, but simply reality. But they're painting in the 19th century tradition, which is essentially monochromatic. We might say one color. There's an awful lot of brown in Eakins, perhaps too much for the modern taste, a little bit too much for my taste, to be perfectly honest. But in a large pastel of mine called Self-Portrait with Jessie and Chow Chow, about 4 by 5 feet in size, and perhaps one of the larger pastels ever done. I'm going for obviously a powerful color, a powerful delineation of character, which is American in the sense of its directness and its power of form, but is European in its strength of color. There's no question in my mind but that all of 20th century painting and all of contemporary painting stems from the 19th century French. The 20th century Germans stem from the French, the 20th century Swiss from the French, the Flemish, the Americans, all stem from the French, and of course the Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists. And perhaps we can look at my picture and its bright color and its strong delineation. And we can go directly to a Lautrec painting of La Galoux, the center figure and entertainer at the Moulin Rouge in the late 19th century in France. And certainly there are similarities in the strong delineation of form, of character, and the somewhat emphasizing two-dimensional pattern as well as three-dimensional substantiality. And if I didn't mention it, a certain strength of color, which is extremely important to me and was important to the French and is important to many, many 20th century painters. Certainly Vincent van Gogh, the intensity of his vision, the intensity of personality, which I've tried to capture in my works. I'm in debt to him without specifically copying technical aspects of his work. Just as I'm in debt, in a way, to German artists like Max Beckmann in his self-portrait with tuxedo. Certainly not in style, and frankly, I don't consider Beckmann one of my progenitors. But there is a power and a directly stated quality there that I have in my work. And we can compare this and go directly back to another shot excuse me, of my pastel and perhaps see some of the similarities as well as the differences. And of course, you know, there's something confrontive about this picture, very strong in the feeling, the expressions on my face, the large forms and the strong colors, something, strong presence of personality. That is in a self-portrait by Rembrandt. Now I'm not trying to say that I'm Rembrandt, just simply to point out what tradition that we're working in. Of course, Rembrandt working in a less colorful old master tradition, and I'm not working in his technique at all. I mean, there are artists who will copy Rembrandt's technique in terms of glazes and monochromatic colors, umbers, siennas, ochres, and so forth. Academic artists who would do that, but if anything, I'm trying to have something of the spirit of Rembrandt, you know, done in my own way. Oskar Kokoschka and the directly stated character of the paint relates to my pastels, the intensity of personality. Edgar Degas and the intense searching of personality, technically related to the more detailed, smooth finished acrylics. Paul Cezanne Self-Portrait, the roughness of the paint, a certain blocky solidity of form that I try to get in pictures like Self-Portrait with books. But you know, we were all artists who tried to respond to the living moment of our time with as much power and freshness as meaning as possible, and no one is copying anybody. See, we could go from my self-portrait to one by Jessie, her self-portrait with cross, painted in a somewhat down period of her life. It's rather drawn, haggard, very powerful statement of personality. Somewhat related in its roughness and directness of expression to the German Paula Modersohn-Becker, here in her nude self-portrait, although Becker's feeling is more lyrically feminine and happily fertile and poetic and not suffering. We go to another of Jessie's self-portraits, directly stated, powerful, certain heaviness of paint, as in Becker. Another self-portrait, similarly painted, more positive in aspect, serious, as most self-portraits are. Her self-portrait with raised hat, which is somewhat rougher, as if she either takes off an old life and puts on a new one, in a sense of having been through difficult experiences. Certainly the expressiveness of this relates to self-portraits like this by Egon Schiele, the early 20th century Austrian expressionist. Jessie also would relate to Oskar Kokoschka in the roughness of the paint, the directly stated, powerful expression of personality. Emil Nolda in a self-portrait. This one painted as an old man in the 1940s, just prior to his death, if I'm correct about this, but one of the major German figures in the 20th century. And we see a similar roughness and directness of statement that would apply to Jessie. Alice Neal in her penetrating studies of figures and portraits is related to Jessie. We look at Jessie's self-portrait of the pop art, not self-portrait, excuse me, portrait of the pop art collector Robert Scull, and we see this powerful searching for personality, the introspection, a certain emphasis on pattern and curving lines that brings out the character, which is closely related to the intensity of a Van Gogh in one of his self-portraits. In my still life painting, for example, a plate with a book of Bosch on the right, so it plays the lightness of the plate and the darkness of the cover of the book, with an illustration by Bosch, somewhat expressing some of the drama of light and darkness that Jessie gets in some of her paintings. I see a certain beauty and meaning in simple things. Now, I put them together often quite complexly, and so that in some periods of my painting they're very thoroughly orchestrated. Every inch of the picture is filled with something, but it all holds together, as someone has described, like the facets of a gem. Everything seems to interlock. But this interest in simple objects clearly stems from people like Chardin in his kitchen still life, the French painter of the 18th century, to Paul Cezanne of the 19th century. I think these artists sensed almost a cosmic meaning in simple things, and I feel that too, that we often ignore everyday reality, whether it's a person or an apple, and we fail to see, if you will, God's hand in all of it, you know, the meaning of life in all of it. Speaking of Cezanne, a pastel of mine, using a book with Cezanne Self-Portrait on the cover, looking over an offering, if you will, of nuts and grapefruit in a bowl, a combination of a sphere, a circle, with a rectangle. Wrong button. Let's just move into a more simply stated still life, acrylic still life of mine, with a simple central image, which is the equivalent of Jessie's large woodchucks. Simply stated, that is me. And in a sense, if you look at it and respond to it, as I hope I did when I painted it, you will see something of yourself in it, something of the richness of your inner personality, some of your inner life, perhaps. 3 tomatoes and a can of chicken of the sea, an acrylic still life, which all of these might be seen to be, particularly the last 2 pictures, might be seen as almost mandalas in the psychological sense of being images of the self, a sense of wholeness of the artist trying to find wholeness of personality, integration of personality in the painting. In Rembrandt's Quartered Bull, we see paint roughly painted an expression of the transcendence of death. The bull with its hind legs spread could almost suggest the crucifixion of Christ. Perhaps something alike is being expressed in this large cassine of dead sunflowers, 5 feet tall, 3.5 feet wide, of the surmounting of difficulties, perhaps in a way of Giacometti's burned figures, that one goes through hell, but if one can survive it, one comes out more whole, more solid, more real, more deeply involved in understanding of the deeper currents of life and the world, the meaning of human life. Not that one can specify it, but one senses a relationship with the deeper issues of life. We can compare the depth of that with the lightness of this painting, Queen Anne's Lace, a cassine, 22 by 30. I don't often show this side of my work, but it's a lighter, more lyrical, more delicately poetic aspect. Large pastel, Portsmouth Harbor, more lyrically, almost impressionist in its sense of light, although very blockily simply stated in form. Snowy landscape with sunset, a large pastel, which again is lyrically poetic hymn to nature, if you will, more delicate than Jessie's. And you know, my inspiration is nature itself, but there's a certain connection with the light-filled qualities of Impressionism, as in Monet's Beach at Saint-Adresse here. Cornfield in green, apple tree and hazy sun, another large pastel by me. So this is a little suggestion of some of the works that will be at the Pond Lane Gallery in Southampton during the time this program is shown. Works exhibited by myself, Don Gray, and my wife, Jessie Benton Evans Gray. We invite you to attend if you're in that area, and we thank you for watching Artist and Critic this afternoon. My name's Don Gray. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.